I started to notice that I was different in ways that were like, even though my family was all females and it was very like feminist ideology, there were certain things that I couldn't do, which was like wear boys' clothes or have short hair or hang out with a lot of boys or instead of like joining the football team or soccer, like I had to be in ballet or I had to do swimming and no contact sports. And so I started to kind of learn like what felt true to me and what was not allowed for me. So I grew up being like a tomboy and being characterized as a tomboy with the ideology that girls can do everything but this and but that. And so when I got into middle school is when I started to really begin to feel that even more when I started going through puberty and the pressure of like fitting in um, impacted a lot of how I dressed. I changed a lot of how I walked, I talked, the way I laughed because I wanted to fit in. I didn't feel like the way that I naturally um, and so it was a lot of hiding myself away and pretending to be someone else until I got into high school and started to question things a little bit more. I started to learn more to think critically for myself what was true to me and what felt right. Um, there was, of course, like people telling me, you look like a boy, or you walk like a boy, you talk like a boy, and that came with a lot of shame and a lot of confusion. And so the more I tried to like fit in, the bigger the disconnect was. So when I started to think critically and started to think about what felt good to me, the thing that made the most sense at the time, because I went to an all-girls Catholic high school, was to come out as a lesbian. Because that was, I think, the closest thing I could to get to what felt authentic to me. And I was lucky enough to have a lot of friends that were in the LGBT community, but never like interacting with anyone that was outwardly trans. And so I didn't even know that was a reality for me. I didn't see it on TV. I didn't hear it about family members. I didn't see it on in my community or in my neighborhood. And so it was really eye-opening to me when I got to college and I met my first trans person. So because I went to Catholic school all the way, I chose my college very specifically to be liberal, to find like community, to find a college that had like a gay straight alliance. And I remember when I first went into that room, like not even expecting to see trans people because I'd never seen them before. And I remember meeting my first like outwardly trans person, and he was a trans man and he had been on testosterone for 3 years, which I thought was like magical because he was so young. And that's when being trans became a reality to me. And it became something that I thought that I could maybe be. And so I began to think about transitioning right then when I met like my first trans person. I think I always knew, but I never had the language and I never knew how to express it. I think even if because growing up in a Catholic school system where you don't hear the word gay, you don't hear the word trans, I still felt it. And just not being able to put it to words, I think caused a lot of turmoil within myself. And when I began to unpack it is when things began to make a lot more sense. And I stopped hiding myself away. And I started really like speaking up for myself, speaking up for other trans people around me. Um, when I began like transitioning, my roommate was also trans, and so I went with him to be like a support system when he started testosterone. And that was waiting in my room, waiting in the waiting room with him. That was like, wow, like this could be me. And I think that's what really solidified it for me was like, this is accessible to me. I can do this. He's doing it. I'm seeing his changes. And I just felt a lot of jealousy that I couldn't do it. So I was like, why not? Like, I'm going to do it. Um, and that came with a lot of like push and pull, a lot of support from my community, being in the LGBT community, a lot of support from like friends, peers, loved ones, but also a lot of pushback from like my own family. I remember when I first came out, the first thing that my mom said to me was like, oh, well, least you're not trans. And I was like, yeah, don't worry about that. And then, you know, years later, here I am sitting in, you know, a Chinese restaurant with like a book in my hand shaking that's like um, a book, A Parent's Guide to Children Who Are Trans, and like giving it to her and having it like annotated and like all these special things that I put in. And I think her main focus was like the physical transition, the physical aspects of it, of okay, what is it going to do to your body? Like you're going to be on hormones, you're going to start surgeries, you're going to look different, um, you're going to risk all these things for your body. And some of the things that I heard from my family were similar, like, you know, why would you mutilate your body? Um, and that was really, it was really difficult to explain to them that I would rather, you know, even if the hormones are a risk, I would rather take that risk and live the way that I wanted to live than to pretend to be someone else. Um, and so for me, the way I came into therapy is because community for me served as family when family could not. It's where I found support. It's where I found resources. It's where I found someone to be with me through top surgery, through all these things that, you know, my family was not present for. And that's what kind of led me to therapy, because I think now there are so many more kids that are experiencing this and maybe have the language for it, but their family's not accepting of it. And to feel these things and to know that the closest people around you don't see you the way that you see you is like, I think that's why there's such high suicide rates among young trans kids and young trans people, because the people that matter most to them don't see them, don't hear them, don't know them. Um, and so my job as a therapist is not only to uplift and validate these feelings for these kids, but also to invite mom in to talk to me, to ask all the questions, to bring all these fears. Because another thing is, parents are also coming out. They're coming out to loved ones that, you know, my child now uses these pronouns, or my child now uses this name. And what does that mean about my parenting? What are people going to say about how I'm parenting if I'm accepting of this, if I'm not accepting of this? And so I have a lot of empathy for parents that are going through it as well, because it's hard, and my mom still struggles. But I think when she can see me being happy, when she can see me, you know, thriving in the role that I am, when she can see me finding community, that's when she kind of began to accept that I was going to be okay. And I think that's what parents really want, is for their child to be okay. And it's hard for them to envision it in a world where many people don't think it's okay to be trans. And so I think it's so important to be doing things like this, where people can hear my story and know that I live a happy and thriving life. I have like lots of friends. I love what I do. I love where I am. I feel safe in my community. I feel safe, you know, going about, and that's also a privilege, because I have access to healthcare and I have access to legal aid and all the things that I need. But that's what we need for kids like me to thrive, is we need that kind of support. And so it's such an honor to be here. And I talked with this a little bit with Christine. I'm very open, so any questions that you have, I will certainly answer. There's no wrong question to me as long as it comes from a point of good intent. You know, language is really difficult these days. It's always changing, but I think that we learn the most when we talk to one another and when we see each other for who we are and what we want to be. But yeah, if anyone has any questions, feel free.
Thank you so much, Felix, for sharing. So we have a few questions in the chat, but I know you wanted to talk a little bit about Arrive. Would now be a good time to kind of talk a little bit about what you guys do there?
Absolutely. Thanks for reminding me. So Arrive is out in Paoli in Pennsylvania. It's about 45 minutes from Philadelphia. And so we are a group of trans therapists. We are trans and queer, and we work with predominantly trans and queer youth, but also adults. Right now, we have a bunch of groups. So I'm running most of the kids groups. And we also have a parents group. So if there are parents that you know that's struggling with this type of thing and need some support, check out Arrive. We also do a lot of outreach. So like things like this, talking to people about what it means to be trans and how to be trans affirming or LGBTQ affirming. We go to schools. We're going to be at Philly Pride. And so a lot of the work is really just creating relationships in our community, creating relationships among families, and creating a deeper relationship with kids that might not know themselves yet. And we do virtual, we do in-person. Right now, Alexander does consults. So if you work in an organization and you want them to learn more about trans things, you can connect with Alexander, and he does a half-hour free consult, or he even will come in and do a whole presentation for organizations so that they can navigate this a little bit more easily. And yeah, it's been so amazing to even consider that I could be amongst other people like me, doing the same work and having the same goals for our community.
And we dropped the link in the chat. So if anybody wants to check it out, it's arrivetherapy.com. And so I'm looking through the questions right now. Tracy asked, Felix, I'm wondering, what does support look like for you in this type of moment when you're considering and making a decision to transition?
That's a really good question. I think one of the things that trans folks struggle with, and I think it's the case for a lot of LGBTQ folks, is that they don't quite know yet. Like they're not quite sure. They don't know, if I start using these pronouns and I change, will that invalidate, how I was feeling before? Or if I use this name and I decide not to, are people going to judge me for changing that? And so I would say support is just to hear them and see them for how they are in the moment, and to accept that there's going to be a lot of transition. There's going to be a lot of change. There's a lot of figuring out what it means to be trans. There's not just, trans men and trans women. There are people that are non-binary that maybe they decide to start hormones and stop hormones, or maybe they decide they don't want hormones and they want to do surgery. So there's so many different ways to be. And so support is just being with them through that, because it's a huge journey, and it's consistently coming out and consistently figuring out new things about yourself.
We talk a lot about radical acceptance, no matter what, right? And that's kind of what we talked about earlier today. So would that be kind of a great place to start?
Absolutely. Yeah. And like for therapy, like radical acceptance is also within a modality of therapy, dialectical behavioral therapy. And it can be applied to anyone, but it's certainly in this circumstance when there's so many other factors going on that make it hard to accept who you are. Radical acceptance is like the first place to start.
So a few other questions in the chat. How many therapists are at Arrive?
So we currently have about 7 therapists. About a handful of us are accepting new clients at the moment. A lot of us are booked. I'm accepting new clients, and there are a couple other that are. And there's one therapist that does only virtual, and I believe they are also accepting new clients. But we have a lot of groups too, which might be more accessible for some folks. And those groups are constantly running.
How did you reach the decision that being a lesbian didn't fit your gender identity? And what would you say to a person that says, in an ideal world, there is no gender, but all people should be able to express their individual characteristics without a gender being assigned to those?
Those are some good questions. Wow, heavy hitting. So the first question, how did I know like being a lesbian wasn't for me? That's a really good question, because what happened was when I began to transition, or like, yeah, when I began to question my gender, I also began to question my sexuality again, because I was in a relationship with a woman and I identified as a woman. So what does it mean if I decide to transition? Does that mean that, we can no longer be in a relationship because they identify as a lesbian? And I was lucky enough that the partner that I was with was also figuring out their gender. So we were able to do that together. And what I learned was I can love in so many different ways. And I learned that, I'm not only am I not a lesbian, but I'm also like bisexual. So knowing my gender more also helped me to accept that I also like men. And yeah, that it goes back to the whole fluid thing. Like things are so different depending on where you're at in life. And then to the question about like gender is a social construct, I do agree. That doesn't change our reality today, though. Even though gender is a social construct, many people see it as real, and it is real. Um, that's how people relate to one another. It's how people um, are raised. It's how people decide maybe career paths. So it's very real, even though it is a construct. We're still impacted by it.
So we have a lot of questions in the chat. I'm so sorry we're not going to be able to get to all of these tonight, but we have a lot of them. So Kathy says that her trans son is having a lot of fear because of the trans hate in the country currently. Any thoughts on how she can support him?
Yeah, this is something that comes up often in my own sessions, and it's really difficult to sit with it and to just bear witness to it because it comes with a feeling of powerlessness that you can't change the laws. You can advocate, of course, but at the end of the day, we only have so much power. I think when we come together as a community like this is when we are most powerful, when we're able to cross lines and see, you know, transness and feminism as one, when we can see racism and transness as one, when we can see all these isms, it's more powerful. But something also that I find hopeful is that there are many countries in which being trans is illegal, and it's deathly. It can be, you can be executed for it. However, given that that is the case, there are still trans people, and there have always been trans people. Our narratives have been erased, but no matter what kind of oppression we've endured, we have always survived. And I think that's because we can find community with one another, and we can find ourselves, and that's what drives us. That's my own beliefs.
And one last question. Are you going to be, well, two questions. Are you sticking around for the breakout rooms?
Yeah, I'll stick around.
Awesome, thank you. And so last question is from a different Kathy. She said, and this is actually something we see a lot. We have a Facebook group of over 200,000 women, and a lot of what they ask is very similar to Kathy's question. So this will be good info to bring back to the people that haven't been able to make it tonight. She says, what advice can you give me? They will be vacationing with family and friends, among which will be Liz, who appears to be transitioning, and they go by they, them pronouns. And she's sure that either her husband or her will screw it up. How do they handle their mistakes?
It happens. It happens. Even I, as a trans person, will misgender another trans person. And I think there are a couple different ways you can go about it, depending on the scenario. If you're in a large group, you could very easily repeat yourself and use the correct pronoun if you catch it. If you do not catch it, something that you can do is go up to that person later and say, hey, I noticed that I did this thing. I want to apologize. Because I think the main thing is just showing that you're aware of it and that you're trying. I think that's what matters most, is that you're trying. Because it happens, our brains slip up no matter how many times we try. We can practice it. We can practice, looking at a dog and being like, I'm not going to assume your gender, or looking at a baby and being like, I'm not going to assume your gender. And we can practice in our heads repeating the name and the pronouns for that person. And I think through practice, it comes more naturally, and it eventually shifts. But I think as a trans person, what matters most to me is that people are trying, and that they're taking accountability if they mess up.
I just wrote that down so I can make sure to share it with our members of our Facebook group. So thank you. Is there anything else you want our members to know before we introduce the author of our book?
I just want to thank you, Christine, and everyone that you're working with, and to thank everyone here. It would not be possible to make change without allies and without people to listen and to hear and to ask questions and to make mistakes. So I'm just really grateful to be here and grateful to have this space to share my story, and to connect with some of you all.
Thank you so much for coming, and you are welcome back anytime. So we're so happy to have you, and thank you for sharing. And next up, we have a very exciting, this is the first time we've ever had an author joining us. So Susan Kuklin. So Susan is the author and photographer of our book for this month, Beyond Magenta. And can you tell us a little bit about the process and what inspired you to write this book?
Sure. Well, first, I'd like to thank you so much for having me and for reading Beyond Magenta. It really means a great deal to me that you're doing what you're doing. In 2010, I had a call from a friend who's a librarian in Wisconsin and said, we don't have enough LGBTQ books that are nonfiction and sort of like yours. We need a book, we need an all-purpose LGBTQ book. What am I saying? LGBTQ book. So I thought about it and it just seemed very vague. And I said, there are lots of wonderful books out. That doesn't make any sense to me. And yet the one group that did not have enough literature were trans people. I didn't find enough literature that would be helpful. So I thought, well, if I did a book, I would want to just focus on that. And at the time, it was really strange because there were not that many outed trans people, at least so the outside world knew, the cis world knew. We didn't even have the word cis, in those days. So people were saying, but they're not, who's going to buy the book? And I said, well, let's just do it anyway, because I just think that we should know about this. There's something going on, something's happening, and it's wrong. I mean, I was hearing about kids getting bullied and beaten and thrown out of their homes and a couple of murders. And I wanted to know, why is gender so important? Isn't the person the one who's important rather than the gender? And why are we seeing everything in this binary male, female way? And I thought that would be an interesting experiment. So I spent a year reading whatever I could, attending meetings, any kind of meetings, Gay Men's Health Clinic in New York. In New York, there were a lot of avenues where I could go. So I started talking to people and meeting people for the first year. And then I met some people at the Callan Lord Health Clinic, and they had a group called HOT, which was a health for trans teens. And I thought, this would be really exactly what I want to do. So I went and I met with them and I met with the staff and I said, what kind of book do you need? What would you want that would be most helpful to your clients? And also, am I the right person to do it? Now I gave them a lot of my other books that I've written, and also where I was just dealing with first person. It was the person who I was interviewing. It was their story. It wasn't mine. I wasn't judging or describing or explaining anything. It was, here's the mic. What do you want people to know about you? And so they said, that's exactly what we needed. So we formed kind of an alliance and we worked together to choose as varied a group of people who were articulate and wanted to do it. It's very important that they volunteered, because we had to be very careful about that. We had to be careful not to compromise the privacy of the client staff relationship. And that's how it all began. And it just started snowballing from that point on.
Do you still keep in contact with any of the teens from the book?
Some of them. I mean, it has been quite a while. And at first, we all stayed in touch with each other, and we were constantly visiting with. They were always coming over to my studio. I have lots of photographs as they progressed in their transition. So that was kind of neat. But then as they started growing up and moving away and having their own lives, we've pretty much lost contact. I have one or two people that I'm still in contact with quite frequently.
What was the reception that they got for being featured in a book like this?
Well, before we started, I said to them, it's conceivable you're putting your life on a page and you could get some bad press. I mean, this could be, I didn't think it was going to be dangerous because I had done 30 books before, and I wrote on topics like teen pregnancy. I wrote about AIDS in the late 80s, and I wrote about teenagers on death row, and I was never banned, which is kind of weird that all of a sudden I'm banned. But it was never such a big deal that they were there. But I thought, just in case, in fact, I told everybody who's in my books, you have to be prepared that some people aren't going to like you and they're going to say nasty things. And so we went from that point of view. Now I think I'm going off on a tangent. I'm sorry about that, but
not at all.
Okay, so that's how we sort of began, just to be sure that they knew what they were getting into. But you never really know. I mean, you never really realize until someone writes, "This is a disgusting person," blah 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 blah. You don't know what it's like to feel that. And I think that's the toughest part of being the author of this book. In fact, I know it is the toughest part.
When we spoke earlier, you told me about an anecdote about the book that you were writing about dreamers. Could you share it with everyone?
Oh, okay. Yeah, that's a book called it was supposed to be a kind of out of the closet book for undocumented immigrants, teenagers who were brought here by their families when they were very, very young, and they became what it's called DACA. I interviewed them in the same way that I did Beyond Magenta, where I photographed them and they told their story of what it was like to live in their community back home, to travel to America, to adapt to America, and then to find that they're undocumented and see what was all the stuff that was going on about that, and how to live undocumented in the United States. So the book was all ready to be published. It was, I worked on it a few years, and I had absolutely fabulous kids in this book, and they were from all over the world. They were from everywhere, and they crossed the desert, but they also came on an airplane, and they came in a car. And so it was just so varied and fascinating. And it was fascinating to see how they were Americanizing their families, and that whole transition of going from being in what my grandmother would call the old country to the new country. And we were all set to do it, and the book was finished. It was all laid out and ready to go to press. It was 3 days before the election, and everyone was sure that Hillary was going to be the president, and this book would help her move along immigration reform, which is really badly needed. It hasn't been dealt with properly in ages. So there was the election, and election night, we all know what happened. And I was, of course, hysterical. At 6 o'clock in the morning, I called my editor, weeping, and she was weeping. And I said, "We can't publish the book. We can't. What will we do if these kids are all deported? They're great. They don't even know any other life." So she went, "Oh my God, you're right." And she went to the president, who promptly put her head on the desk and banged her head on the desk a few times and said, and she picked up all the mechanicals and all the whole book that was ready to go out. She put it in a drawer. She locked the drawer and said, "Let's wait till we figure out what to do." So we waited a year, and then, but meanwhile, the kids were saying, "We want our story told. And we're not going to be afraid of this. We want our story told." Some people were afraid. Some parents were very worried. And we figured out that if we take out their picture and take out their name, their story is still their story. So we left the frame and the caption of every picture, but it's a blank page. It's a blank, and we just put their first initial in the text. We took out what schools they went to and anything that was identifying, and that's how we published the book. Not fun for a photographer, I'll tell you, but it was. I mean, there was no way I was going to let anything happen to these kids. So it's a problem in the States now. I mean, everyone's ready to ban everything. You know, there's just no room for diversity. And I think that's the thing that makes this country interesting.
That was actually my next question.
Oh.
So why do you think books like yours are being banned, and what do you think we can do about it?
Well, I think what you're doing is what we can do about it. You know, I think that is the most important thing. We should be shouting from the rafters. We should be marching. We should be screaming. We should be writing letters, and of course, voting. So that's one thing. And I frankly think this is just a political movement because it's always been here. But now all of a sudden, the far right has been able to do something about pregnancy and women's right to choose. They have all their guns. They have so many guns, so they needed an issue, and this is an easy one, right? It was taking people who are a small group who are vulnerable and vilifying them. Oh, perfect. So I think that's what's going on.
Is there anything else you'd like our members to know, or anything else that you'd like to talk about this evening before we start our breakout rooms?
Oh, sure. Well, I think the most important thing about books, LGBTQ books, books on race, books on any kind of diversity, is that people need to hear about this. People need to be seen. There's an expression that librarians use called mirrors and windows. A child wants to be able to see themselves in literature and hear their stories, and they also want to, but they also want to look through the window to see other people, and that's what that's what education's about, and that's who we are, to be full people. So I think it's really important that we keep this in mind as we do our reading and we choose what we want to read.
Thank you so much for being here.